In this lecture, we're going to discuss the 13 American colonies' separation from Britain, the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, and the post-war political dilemmas that led the United States to create a federal constitution from 1787 to 1788. In our last unit, we discussed critical events from 1763 to 1775 that transformed the idea of creating an American nation from an unfeasible daydream into a necessity for the colonist. This lecture will continue that story. You will frequently hear the names of founders like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson that played an extremely significant role in the American Revolution. Understand, however, that the United States' victory in that conflict was not solely the triumph of those wealthy men. Certainly, elites played a central role in crafting the larger ideological justifications of American independence and acting as political and military leaders. But the revolution succeeded as a result of the on-the-ground participation of all Americans, of all classes, genders, and races. By the summer of 1776, many elites in American society favored independence because, in their view, the British king and parliament had become corrupt. They had lost their way. For many others, though, especially lower socioeconomic Americans, the rebellion became about a much larger rejection of aristocratic traditions and deference altogether. In this sense, many Americans fought for what we might refer to as Republican government, a term that has nothing to do with politics of the current day. To people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, a Republican system meant having a virtuous government with elected representatives, a system free of tyrannical kings or ruling aristocrats that maintained power through hereditary succession. Such a government, they believed, would protect what the British political philosopher John Locke referred to as natural rights, an individual's right to life, liberty, and property, or what Thomas Jefferson tweaked to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. The purpose of this lecture is to explain how the United States struggled to create such a system throughout its first years, how the founders struggled to satisfy public demands for liberty and yet still maintain a system of order and stability the country desperately needed. Republics, everyone was keenly aware, rarely worked out in world history. Let's return to the year of 1775 and discuss the breaking point that led to open warfare between the 13 American colonies and Britain. We closed last time by talking about the Continental Congress's formation of the Association in September 1774, an effort to boycott all British goods in the colonies. That effort was strikingly successful in the following year. The sale of British goods fell by 97% in the colonies as tensions skyrocketed with Britain. Before the Continental Congress would reconvene again in May 1775, the first shots of the Revolutionary War rang out at Lexington in Concord, Massachusetts in April. On the night of April 18, 1775, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, the British general who said that problems with the Americans could only be resolved by force, sent some 700 British troops in Boston to seize military supplies the Massachusetts militia had been quietly gathering in Concord, a town 24 miles northwest of Boston. As tensions grew between the colonies and Britain, the governor had reasonable concerns that stockpiles of gunpowder and arms might be turned on British troops soon. Moreover, such seizures were not without recent precedent. In September of 1774, for example, British troops seized a huge supply of militia gunpowder outside of Boston in an event that became known as the Powder Alarm. In the aftermath of that seizure, rumors spread that British soldiers had killed colonial citizens, that British ships bombarded Boston to punish its rebellious citizens. However, the Powder Alarm was a false alarm. The British seizure had been completely peaceful. No one had been killed. Before this was discovered, however, rumors of bloodshed had reached the Continental Congress, then in session. John Adams recalled Congress's reaction. Quote, "When the horrid news was brought here of the bombardment of Boston, which made us completely miserable for 2 days, we saw proofs of both the sympathy and the resolution of the continent. War War, war was the cry, and it was pronounced in a tone which would have done honor to the oratory of a Briton or a Roman. If it had proved true, you would have heard the thunder of an American Congress. After the truth emerged, anger from the powder alarm did not totally subside. The emotion that the colonists felt, a notion of us versus them, remained. In response, the Massachusetts militia began to store up whatever military resources they could from September 1774 to April 1775 in case the next alarm proved true. So, fast forward to April 1775, when General Gage ordered the seizure of militia supplies at Concord. The Massachusetts militia was far more emboldened to defy approaching British soldiers, and, somewhere along the way, a spoken and unspoken willingness to fight emerged throughout its ranks. So when British troops marched to Concord on the evening of April 18th, 1775, things were quite different than they had been a year earlier. On that evening, Paul Revere's famed nighttime ride into the countryside took place as he sought to send warnings of the British approach, an incident of much historical mythology. What was Paul Revere up to that night? Well, he certainly wasn't screaming, "The British are coming!" at the top of his lungs. The countryside had plenty of British loyalists in the area. Instead, Revere rode hurriedly to warn colonial leaders that might be arrested and tell friendly ears, quietly, that the regulars are coming out. He also asked other riders to help warn Concord and surrounding towns like Lexington. The Massachusetts militia, for its part, had been tipped off about a potential raid weeks earlier and had already moved any supplies from Concord. Around dawn, on April 19th, 1775, British troops came upon the town of Lexington as they marched towards Concord. There, some 80 colonial militia stood on a village green near the road. The Massachusetts militia officer commanding the 80 or so men, John Parker, realized the British force was 700 soldiers strong, and he had no plan to attack the British column. Instead, he ordered his men to show themselves but not block the road. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here, he allegedly told them. As British troops approached and saw Parker's militia, they formed battle columns and ordered the colonists to lay down their arms. Somewhere in this confusion, a fateful shot rang out. Who fired the shot? The first bullet of the Revolutionary War? No one knows. But the reaction was enormous. Hearing the shot, the colonial militia fired into the British troops, fearing for their lives. The British responded by returning fire and charging. In the ensuing fight, 8 militiamen were killed, including one stabbed to death, and a British soldier was wounded. The militia quickly dispersed, however, fleeing to Concord. In the aftermath, word spread of the fighting. Large groups of Massachusetts militia moved towards Concord. British troops were allowed to search that town before the colonial militia, with numbers swelling to near 1,000 from the countryside in the afternoon, attacked British troops, leading to a full-out battle around Concord that forced British troops to retreat to Boston. The Revolutionary War had commenced. Following the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurred outside Boston as colonial militia surrounded the city. At that battle, some 1,200 colonial militiamen withstood a British assault from more than 3,000 soldiers seeking to drive them from the area. Colonial forces fought back effectively, proving their resolve. Though they ultimately fell back, they inflicted heavy losses on the British. As these battles occurred in the Massachusetts colony, colonial militiamen began to seize military supplies and drive out British officials. The Massachusetts militiamen, converging around Boston, formed what would become the Continental Army in June 1775. When the Second Continental Congress reconvened in May 1775, things had changed dramatically. The colonies were in chaos. Royal colonial governments had stopped working. Blood had been spilled. Despite these developments, the Continental Congress remained uncertain of whether to declare independence from Britain. Mixed opinions were pervasive, especially from colonies like Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. On July 6, 1775, as a result, the delegates created a declaration of causes explaining why armed rebellion had broken out and an olive branch petition declaring the colonies willing to negotiate with King George III on taxes and trade issues. While colonial leaders like John Adams disliked the idea, pro-independence patriots bided their time. The British king, for his part, rejected the Congress's petitions immediately, declaring them traitors and refusing negotiations. In December of 1775, moreover, the British Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act. The act stated that Britain would crush American commerce until they begged for pardon for the armed uprising. Thereafter, British ships blockaded American ports, seized American ships, and started to strangle the colony's economic lifelines abroad. These events bolster the arguments of colonial leaders pushing independence. And the following year, from 1775 to 1776, the Continental Congress, though not a national government, began to act like one, creating an army, appointing ambassadors, signing treaties, raising finances, and issuing paper money. Amid these raucous events, a no-name British guy, Thomas Paine, a former tax collector in Britain, if you can believe it, entered the fray, authoring a pamphlet called Common Sense. Published on January 10, 1776, at first anonymously, Common Sense outlined why the colony should declare independence. The pamphlet sold over 120,000 copies in 3 months, 500,000 copies in a year, and went through 25 editions. Why was Common Sense so hugely popular? It was a forceful, yet plain synthesis of the political values behind the rebellion that appealed to the colonial population. In that pamphlet, Paine argued that hereditary succession in the British monarchy ensured inept rulers would eventually come to power. Quote, "One of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary rights in kings," Paine states, "is that nature disproves it. Otherwise, she would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion." End quote. Demanding an independent American nation, Paine called for egalitarianism, virtuous government without corruption, ending deference and hereditary privileges, and ensuring the natural rights of individuals, including life, liberty, and property. These values, the bread and butter of why the American Revolution happened, appealed to ordinary Americans who rejected the idea of kneeling before lords based on their family name and wealth. With Paine's arguments ringing throughout the country, the Continental Congress took up the issue of independence in the summer of 1776. Each of the 13 colonies' representatives had to receive approval to even vote on independence. After April 1776, however, colonial governments, one by one, began to pass the needed resolutions, though Pennsylvania and Maryland remained undecided. In May 1776, John Adams began writing parts of what would become the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. The next month, Congress tasked Thomas Jefferson with writing the bulk of the Declaration with help from 4 others. After Jefferson completed that document on June 28th, extensive wrangling consumed the Congress about whether to take that final, fateful step. Ultimately, however, 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of independence on July 2nd, and independence was declared 2 days later, July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence remains one of the most brilliant documents in world history. Even as the newly born United States, maintaining a system of slavery, was rife with internal contradictions, the words of that document, "All men are created equal," formed a guiding principle that countless groups struggled to make a reality over the following centuries as Americans struggled against the injustice of racism, sexism, and classism. As John Adams wrote of the Declaration, quote, "Yesterday, the greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was or will be decided among men." End quote. After the Declaration of Independence, the young United States faced its first task, defeating the greatest military power on earth, Britain. America's prospects for winning were not bright. The United States, though, did have one major advantage: the Atlantic Ocean and its huge geographical size. Such a large landmass, American leaders knew, would be nearly impossible to occupy with foreign troops during a war. Another advantage the U.S. had was the ideological fervor of its soldiers. Many Americans, you see, didn't serve because they were being paid. They largely went without pay much of the time, or because they were being drafted, though this happened too. but primarily because of their dedication to the ideals of the Revolution, a rejection of tyranny, the preservation of life, liberty, and property. This inspired ordinary men and women to carry out the war effort on the front lines and on the home front. The founders of the young country never could have prevailed over the British without broad public participation in the conflict. Let's briefly discuss the participants in the Revolutionary War. From 1775 to 1783, some 250,000 Americans fought in some form of the Continental Army, though that force often numbered less than 20,000 at any one time, and 35,000 at the peak of the war. Some 12,000 French troops later fought alongside American troops after 1778. Britain, for its part, had an average of 60,000 troops in America to fight the war. They also hired German Hessian mercenaries, accounting for approximately one-third of the British force in America. Some 25,000 American loyalists, those who supported the king over the U.S., also fought with the British. Colonial women played an indispensable role in organizing the war effort on the home front. They raised money for the Continental Army, ran homesteads and family businesses, and made clothes for soldiers. 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army, and 2 all-black units existed from Rhode Island and Maryland. However, another 10,000 African Americans, mostly in the South, fought with the British. At the outset of the war, the royal governor of Virginia offered African American slaves freedom in exchange for joining the British. Some 13,000 Native Americans, primarily from the Iroquois, Creek, and Seminole tribes, fought for the British, though smaller numbers of Native American tribes fought for the United States. While some naively expected the Continental Army to defeat the British quickly, its commander, George Washington, who had served in the British Army during the French and Indian War, knew extreme difficulties were coming. From Washington's view, the United States could win through dragging out the war. As long as the U.S. Continental Army survived, it would serve as a symbol of American resistance. And the longer the war went on, he realized, the greater the chance that France or another European power would help the United States, and the greater the chance that Britain would give up. So, with this in mind, Washington often retreated. He won few battles. His goal was to fight when possible to win and avoid disaster. Only in this strategic sense can we speak of Washington as a great military general. While there's not enough time in this lecture to discuss the events of the Revolutionary War at great length, Washington succeeded in dragging out the conflict and preserving the Continental Army, even as New York City and then Philadelphia, the capital of the new country, fell to the British, as well as an array of other towns and cities in the new United States. Washington's Continental Army in the north and colonial forces in the south never stopped their resistance to the British. In 1778, this strategy paid off hugely when the young United States negotiated a treaty with the French to enter the war. While the French monarchy cared little about the ideological principles of the American Revolution, it was always eager to take advantage of an opportunity to do harm to the British. Thus, America and France signed 2 treaties in February 1778, one establishing commercial relations and national recognition, and the other offering French forces to the U.S. if Britain and France went to war, which they did in June 1778. The entrance of France into the conflict, later joined by Holland and Spain in an alliance against Britain, turned the Revolutionary War into a global conflict. By late 1780, the war continued to drag on despite many British tactical victories, but the constant survival of American forces. Reinforced by the French, Washington's Continental Army began to look for a decisive victory that would force Britain to give up. The following summer of 1781, Washington found his chance after receiving word that a major French fleet was sailing for the Chesapeake Bay. Thereafter, Washington decided to march from New Jersey to Virginia to meet the French fleet and corner British forces under General Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. Tricking the British into thinking that Washington was attacking New York City, then occupied by the British, the Continental Army marched south to Virginia. Thereafter, U.S. and French forces laid siege to Yorktown in September and forced the surrender of a British force of 7,000 men on October 19, 1781. The decisive victory Washington wanted. Consequently, peace negotiations between the United States and Britain began in March 1782, with Benjamin Franklin and John Jay negotiating on America's behalf. The U.S. goal was for Britain to recognize America's independence. What followed was the Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, an incredible document that far exceeded the Americans' expectations. In that treaty, Britain accepted American independence, gave up all its territory east of the Mississippi and south of Canada, except Florida, and gave the Americans generous fishing rights in the Atlantic. The U.S. government, in turn, agreed to help British merchants collect outstanding debts from the Revolution and compensate loyalists whose lands were seized. In September 1783, the last British troops set sail from New York City. The Revolutionary War was over. After this momentous victory, the United States had to digest the peace. They faced the difficult task of creating a lasting governing structure for the country. The American citizens, poor and rich, were left mulling what exactly the Revolution had meant. As the United States entered its first years as a new nation, many were deeply concerned that a tyrant would emerge and suppress Americans' natural rights. In similar political experiments in history, republics hadn't lasted very long. As a result, after the Revolutionary War, people like Samuel Adams, a renowned Boston patriot, were extremely sensitive to any developments that might lead to the overthrow of the new American Republic by a tyrant. To Samuel Adams, a Republican society would represent a, quote, way of life, a core ideology, an uncompromising commitment to liberty, and a total rejection of aristocracy. Before the war, many former colonies had property qualifications to vote for elected officials. After the war, though, white citizens, particularly veterans who had fought against the British, demanded that state legislatures lower property qualifications for voting. The argument was that no individual, quote, can be free and independent unless they have a, quote, choice of the most important officers in the legislature, end quote. After the war, almost all the new states lowered property qualifications for voting. Pennsylvania and Georgia got rid of them altogether, letting all free white men vote in elections. A radical move for the time. Elites, as you might have guessed, felt uncomfortable with the greater inclusion of less affluent citizens in the political process. Elites worried about mob rule. Democracy was a dirty word. Too much power among the lower classes, and huge representative legislatures, they feared, would lead to a lack of authority and chaos. These concerns were not without some justification. During the Revolutionary War, for instance, most state governments radically reduced the power of governors to prevent dictators and created large, powerful legislatures. However, during the war, many governors had little power at critical moments. They often couldn't appoint officials or veto bills even as the British advanced. Overly powerful legislatures, consisting of hundreds of representatives with contrasting opinions, often created chaos in wartime. These same developments played out at a national level. After the Declaration of Independence in November 1777, the Continental Congress created the Articles of Confederation. Formally ratified by all the American states in 1781, the Articles of Confederation created a governing structure with relatively autonomous states and a weak central government. The Articles were inspired by a Republican desire to prevent the rise of a tyrant on a national level. Under that governing structure, the national government was given little power except with regard to foreign policy, military issues, interstate conflicts, and Native American affairs. Specifically, the Articles of Confederation did the following. The Articles created a unicameral legislature, meaning a one-house legislature. The Articles forbade Congress and national government from issuing taxes on the states, and as a result, even during the midst of a war, the U.S. went broke. Congress had to plead with the states to voluntarily offer money. The Articles created the government with no president or executive branch. Perhaps most problematic, the Articles required every state to agree to any changes in the Articles of Confederation, an almost impossible feat. Ultimately, the Articles created a national government that couldn't run the country, a government that couldn't ensure its most important duty, creating stability and preventing chaos, even as it ensured the liberty and freedom of its citizens. As mentioned, one of the most significant problems was that states had to volunteer money to the central government since it couldn't pass taxes. Thus, with no money and little economic control, the U.S. government couldn't pay its soldiers, regulate trade domestically, live up to its international financial obligations, or even agree on a permanent national capital. Well, the Confederation government attempted to solve its financial problems in 1781 by asking the states to ratify a 5% national tax on imported goods. one state out of 13, Rhode Island, voted down the law and prevented it from taking effect. Convinced the Articles of Confederation were a failure, James Madison, a founder and future president, worked in the Confederation Congress to set up a new constitutional convention in May 1787 to write a new governing document. As plans were laid for such an event, Shays Rebellion occurred from August 1786 to June 1787. Shays Rebellion occurred in western Massachusetts when farmers, led by Daniel Shays, a war veteran, started an armed revolt in protest of economic problems and political elitism in Boston, the state's capital. Shays' armed uprising forcibly closed courthouses to prevent courts from holding bankruptcy hearings and foreclosings on farmers' property. The rebellion reached its peak when 800 men under Shays marched on a U.S. government arsenal at Springfield. The U.S. Congress, however, was unable to send national troops to put down the revolt because it had no money. Shays' Rebellion was only stopped when rich Boston businessmen hired mercenary forces of some 4,000 troops to defeat the uprising. The rebellion was critical in convincing Congress of the need for a stronger central government. Thus, from May 14th to September 17th in Philadelphia, the nation's most brilliant politicians, lawyers, merchants, and farmers from 12 states gathered to debate how to improve the government. Rhode Island refused to send representatives to the convention. As delegates trickled in from states to start the convention, it was agreed that proceedings would take place in complete secrecy, and that a majority vote would decide key issues to prevent any one state from thwarting the country's progress. As debates began, including all of the nation's preeminent political figures, James Madison pushed a plan with a stronger central government called the Virginia Plan. Introduced on May 29, 1787, the plan called for a president elected by Congress, a judicial branch, and a bicameral legislature with a lower house picked by direct election, an upper house picked by members of Congress following nominations from state legislatures. An array of debates about other potential plans followed, but the Virginia Plan emerged with the most support by mid-June, as delegates argued about how the plan would work in practice. For instance, issues emerged over what would a two-house legislature look like. Big states wanted each state's delegations to Congress to be determined by population size, but smaller states, fearing that populous states would dominate the government, wanted equal voting power in Congress regardless of population size. To solve these conflicts, from July 2nd to July 5th, a committee met and submitted what was known as the Connecticut Compromise. It said, 1, that every state should have equal voting power in the Senate with 2 senators each, and 2, that representatives in the lower house would be based on proportional representation of each state's population. Thus, each state would get 1 member in the House of Representatives for every 30,000 people in its population. However, this notion of proportional representation raised still larger disagreements. If a state's number of U.S. representatives would be based on its population, Northerners worried that the South would receive an unfair number of representatives from its enslaved African American population. To resolve that conflict, the committee negotiated a rather disgusting deal called the 3/5 Compromise. This said that for every 5 slaves, congressional districts would get credit for 3 voters. In other words, for every African American slave, each state would get 3/5 credit towards a U.S. representative. Slavery, a complete contradiction of everything the U.S. Constitution would be about, was a national shame obvious to the convention's delegates. But even as some delegates fought to ban the practice, a few southern states refused to join the Union if it was outlawed. The issue consumed the convention for a time. The majority of the Constitutional Convention, by just 1 vote, approved these compromises to the Virginia Plan on July 16th, and a committee was formed to write the actual federal Constitution. During that time, the rest of the convention debated specific issues like, how would a U.S. president be elected? To solve that particular problem, the convention created an electoral college, consisting of delegates picked by local elections or state legislatures to vote for the president on behalf of the people. Every state's electoral votes would be equal to the number of its members in the U.S. House and Senate. Whoever won the election in the Electoral Congress became president, and whoever finished second became vice president. If no one received a majority, the election would be decided in Congress with every state getting 1 vote. With the convention agreeing on this plan, 39 delegates signed the new U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia in September 1787 and called for special state conventions to ratify the Constitution. 3/4 of the U.S. states needed to approve the document for it to be ratified. Proponents of the Constitution, those adamantly in favor of a strong central government, became known as Federalists. Those opposed became known as the Anti-Federalist. The Anti-Federalists were a wide collection of groups and individuals, including Southern slave owners, middle-class citizens from New York and Pennsylvania, as well as rural Western farmers. They feared an overly powerful government and said the document did not do enough to protect individual rights. To promote the ratification of the Constitution, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay authored a series of pro-Constitution essays in what became known as the Federalist Papers from October 1787 to August 1788. This was a series of some 85 essays published anonymously under the name Plebeius. As New York and Virginia debated the Constitution, two states critical for overall ratification, the Federalist Papers proved influential in convincing delegates to vote for the document. Both states narrowly approved it. After the Constitution's ratification, Madison and other founders added the Bill of Rights to placate anti-Federalist criticism. The Bill of Rights, created in June of 1789, added 10 amendments spelling out what are today some of our most precious rights in the United States, like the freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to due process, the right to a fair and speedy trial by jury, among many others. Thus, it was through this long, winding, and often complicated process that the United States created the world's most enduring and successful political structure. The United States government, denying justice to African Americans, women, and Native Americans in the many years that followed, while preserving the interest of middle and upper class white men preeminently, remained rife with internal contradictions, of course. But the federal Constitution's enduring political protections for the individual and its governing framework bequeathed to future generations the political tools needed to prevail over injustice in American society. Thank you for listening.